Dr. Haynes, I'm happy to have you with us today.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. So looking at your background, you started out in academia, and since then you've been a tech entrepreneur, chief of staff, founder, COO, CEO, and president, just to name a few. What inspired you to get involved in all these different roles throughout your professional career, mainly in the venture and private equity industry?
Thank you for that question. One of the things that I think is a thread that goes throughout my career is my value to impact the most people with the limited time that we're promised on this earth. So I started as a clinical psychologist at the PhD, working with one-on-one counseling, 50-minute hours, and then did group therapy, reaching more people within that hour. And then I became a faculty member to reach more students every semester. I had 200 students every semester that I taught full-time as a tenured professor. One of the hallmark issues was that when I worked with children and traumatized children at the time in hospital settings with healthcare issues and access to healthcare limitations and disenfranchised populations, I realized that I want to work on the preventative side. And to do that, you need to have resources and financial resources. So I applied for a fellowship at Georgetown, and I became a faculty member after that fellowship, where I was responsible for 5 different hospitals to prevent those issues that we see with African American women and Hispanic. Access to healthcare is a huge issue for disparities in healthcare. So I managed 5 different hospitals, from Howard University Hospital, GW, Columbia Hospital for Women, and Washington Hospital Center. And I think one thing that I really love to do is work to educate folks on how healthcare intersects with economic power as well. And that's the founding kind of values of our family, Peshawar Haynes Foundation as well, which I'll speak to later. But my career has really pivoted many times, and each time it's really been about increasing my ability to reach more people and to prevent some of the healthcare issues, as well as economic access for underserved populations. So I was working in these 5 different hospitals, doing clinical research, and was on the faculty at Georgetown. I was then recruited to work in Silicon Valley to do the due diligence for their healthcare related and wellness related investments, but also working closely as a clinical psychologist. I was doing executive coaching as well to help build goals and work on positive psychology models so that the teams and the founders can set goals that were achievable and that were based on values and milestones to reach. And so part of my background as an entrepreneur, very young age as an immigrant, has parlayed into venture capital and research and scientific background, as well as helped to break some of the barriers that we see in STEAM and women and underrepresented populations not being showcased as much, which is why I started Dr. Haynes Collective, which we'll probably touch on at some point later. But it's really important for me. The common element is really to break the mold of what's expected, especially of women. As an immigrant woman, I was fortunate to be able to come to this country from a place where there was revolution, and women wouldn't have access to the revolution, education and economic resources. So it's really wonderful to be able to have that opportunity in the United States. So being able to get my PhD at age 29, becoming a faculty member by age 33, and a full-time faculty thereafter, I think, has been my goals to try to expedite how much time I have to get my goals achieved and break barriers of what people expect from a clinical psychologist, being able to parlay many different fields.
That's great. I was going to ask you a follow-up question. Was it a difficult transition moving from an academic institution to a venture capital world? How was that for you?
It's interesting. And that's another barrier that people have, or, you know, stereotype that people have, is that people in academia are not able to be nimble and work with limited resources. As a faculty member, that's all we know, is to work with limited resources and be able to build relationship among disciplines, among departments, with chairmen, with deans, and to be able to build relationships that are long-term, to be able to get some of the initiatives done. So, and we work very quickly. So to get those kind of relationships done. And Silicon Valley really works 24/7. I was at NIH in Washington, DC, in Bethesda area. So I'm used to the East Coast kind of speed. And when we moved to Silicon Valley, it's like East Coast on steroids. It's really like 24/7. And we all prided ourselves on, you know, oh, I only got 3 hours of sleep. Another person would say, oh, I only got 2 hours of sleep, and look at me continuing to perform. And, you know, what I realized time and time is that all of these executives and founders and people in tech who are incredibly creative, incredibly bright, are really burning the midnight oil and their resources, because it's not sustainable when you are not sleeping for very long to be able to function at your peak performance. So having those different pillars, the 5 pillars I've developed, is really important, so that people can have balance, more balance. There's no such thing as balance, but try to have time for wellness, as well as, you know, financial goals and community goals, and having a collective experience where we help each other as a community, also to build long-term relationships rather than transactional relationships. So yeah, my goal has been to break molds and to break stereotypes of what people expect, and go in with an open mind of curiosity first and foremost, and wanting to learn. And you have to get comfortable also with imposter syndrome, because anytime you pivot, anytime you do something new, it's going to be something that you don't know 100%. And so wanting to learn, asking questions, and not being always the expert and at the table initially, until you learn the language, the lexicon, the wording, all of that was very different in the venture capital world and you know, than in academia per se, in the scientific world.
Great. So you've worked directly with founders in leading the investment committees of Uber, Airbnb, Q, Curology, Doctors on Demand, Slack, and Hyperloop One. With the level of success that these companies have had in the industry, what were some of the lessons learned having gone through this experience, and what do you wish you would have known ahead of time?
That's an excellent question. I think the common themes, there's a couple of them that I've seen among the best of the best is, and best in class, is to this work ethic is so important, that they are willing to sacrifice pretty much everything for their goal, and to have that drive to be able to push yourself when it's uncomfortable, push yourself when you're tired, and push yourself when you're not motivated. You know, I've had the pleasure of co-founding a company with Usain Bolt, who's the fastest man in the world, and he still has a coach. And the importance of this kind of idea of having coaches and having mentors is really to say that all of us are going to have times where we have to dig deep and don't have the motivation, or maybe sometimes we need a coach to help us get us to the next level, and show up to the practices. So show up and be present, and give ourselves that time, because life, you know, we're multitasking and we're being pulled in many different ways. But the thing that I think is a common denominator for many of these founders is that they have a singular mindset and a singular goal to get to their goal. And so sometimes when you're moving that fast, you have blind spots as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so you need a really good team of individuals who are not only optimistic and see your vision and see that everything is possible, which is kind of the theme around Silicon Valley is that anything is possible. The theme around the United States is anything, you know, the American dream is that it's possible, right?
Right.
And so being able to reignite that possibility is really important, even among the team, to know that if, you know, sometimes the moonshot ideas of Hyperloop, for example, to actually be able to see it happen, to actually see it into reality, and the President Obama's administration, scientists looking at it and saying this is possible. It's incredible to be a part of this visionary group with Richard Branson, bringing him onto the company as well, and building partnerships. It's really been one of the biggest key takeaways, I would say, is that the people that are successful are not just transactionary. They don't look, you know, over your shoulder at dinner parties to see who else they can talk to. They really are able to build relationships one-on-one with people in a tangible way. And so that kind of emotional intelligence is really important. A lot of the top founders I've seen that are not only scientific engineers and have technical background and incredible minds, but they also have emotional intelligence to be able to read nonverbals, to be able to be present, to have eye contact. And so all of those are the kind of the soft skills that we talk about, but it's so important to be able to get your team to believe in your vision, to be able to articulate that and communicate that in a way that is visceral and people can be emotionally tied into that value. And so when you move so fast, you're going to have blind spots. So that's why it's important to have people where my role was a chief of staff, is to be able to see around the corners, to be able to anticipate some of the challenges, and to be able to articulate possible setbacks before they happen. Not to be negative or negative Nancy or, you know, the sky is falling mindset, but to be able to look ahead for risk and liability, which is my lens as a clinical psychologist when I worked at threat assessment teams. So when I was in college campuses, I realized there's no plan if there was an active shooter. So my lens has been really helpful to bring to the business world. When we're working with optimists, we're dealing with people who are visionary, who see the best in everyone. My goal is not to diffuse that, but to add value, to make sure that I'm covering the bases and protecting the ultimate goal.
Great. So let's talk about this year. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a lot of economic uncertainty in global financial markets. What are some of the latest trends in the venture capital space that you've noticed, especially as it relates to the investment viability on startups?
Yeah, I think the most important critical factor that we saw in the 2008, financial turn is that there were so many incredible ideas that came into light, including Airbnb and Uber, and looking at different models and being creative around the reality that we're dealing with is, something that has been, unprecedented. People say that word all the time because there's no playbook for this. And the people in the startup world are used to that. We're used to not having a playbook. So when they would say, Dr. Haynes, what's the thing that, what's the budget for this activity, or how much budget? I'm like, I don't know. We've never done this before. Right. So the idea is to be resourceful, figure out what's the cheapest we can get, call different vendors, get 3 bids. And so we're used to having protocols to deal with ambiguity. And so it's actually something that is a strength when you're used to used to managing ambiguity. And so I'm very hopeful that there's going to be a lot of great ideas that are going to come from this pandemic, and people are shifting into more like Zoom interviews that we're doing here, instead of getting on a plane and impacting the environment, or getting in your car and impacting the environment, having to find parking and having the hassle of traffic. You're much more efficient. You can actually get much more done more efficiently using technology for good. And so those are the kinds of adaptations that we're seeing. People are working more remotely. People are comfortable with that. A lot of employers were not comfortable with that because they thought that they would, people would be goofing off, or not really focusing on their work, or not meeting the deliverable deadlines. But what we're seeing actually, in fact, is that people are a lot more accessible, and people are actually more exhausted because they're people know you're home. You're not going anywhere.
Yeah, where else
So
could
people
you
are
be?
texting, and people are, all different hours. So there's no boundaries, as it were. In a startup world, we really don't have a 9 to 5 anyway, but this is, again, like another level of efficiency and productivity, which is important to remember, to maintain some of those boundaries, to have time for wellness and sleep and community time and connecting with people and calling people and reaching out, making sure I think people are handling things well. So I think that's what we're seeing is the commercial real estate in San Francisco and New York and all of that is being impacted because the overhead cost is actually not necessary, right? It's actually a different model of work-life existence. So people can live anywhere. And that was the whole idea of Hyperloop, was to that people can live anywhere and work anywhere and be able to get there quickly. With magnetic levitation and not polluting the environment.
Great. You have been a huge proponent of leading a company culture with diversity and inclusion coaching in order to maximize human potential and organizational development. Mm-hmm. What strategic initiatives did you implement to help establish innovative ways of tracking and promoting diversity and inclusion? Do you have any use cases you could share as far as that?
It's interesting. When people say innovation, people always think it's got to be something that's like rocket science. It doesn't have to be innovation. Innovation is really finding another solution to a problem, right? And that's really the key. When I'm hiring, that's one of the key factors that I'm looking for, and many CEOs are looking for, is that ability to problem solve, that ability to come with a problem and a solution, to do due diligence, to do your research, to be able to come with varied options. And so I think when we're looking at diversity inclusion, it's really about having a multidisciplinary team, is how I was trained in the medical model. And we were so incredibly productive because we had every discipline looking at this one patient and one client, whoever, whatever the problem is you want to use the same metaphor for, to solve their problem. And so we had the lens of each discipline coming in saying, this is my value add. And from my perspective, might be a solution. And marketing can come and say, from my position, this is something we can try. And product development can be at the same table saying, this is a solution that we can add. And so you come up with very efficient solutions and innovative solutions from sometimes places that most people overlook. And I say that because one of the ways that I implemented this diversity and team building in our company was to have, Wednesdays we would break bread together and we do lunch and learn. So we would actually, hire, we buy the food so everyone can actually sit down and eat together. And there's amazing power when you actually break bread together, of camaraderie, just by eating together, and not just sitting at your desk and trying to get things done, right? We all do that. But to have that sacred time to sit down eyeball to eyeball or side by side, to actually say, when we'd go around the table, and I would start this as a CEO, to say, what's my goal this week? What are some anticipated problems, setbacks that I'm anticipating? What are some successes that I've had in the past that I've utilized? And so those are kinds of things that, as a leader, if you show a level of vulnerability to say that, I don't have all the answers all the time. Anyway, as soon as I got my PhD, I realized how little I knew, because there's so much more that you need to learn in the world, and research is changing all the time, and information is changing all the time. So it's important to keep up with it. And so we had the CEO and the interns and engineering and product development and marketing and social media, all of our team, not just the heads, but everyone was there around this table, and each person would go around and say what their goal was for the week. What are the anticipated setbacks? What are some support they might need around that? And so everybody as a team would say, hey, I know somebody here, I've done this before, I know a vendor that can solve that problem, or I have someone I know that can, have you tried this, or have you tried that? And sometimes, you know, the more introverts, and that's why diversity is important. You don't want all extroverts that are outspoken and are going to be the verbose ones that are always the one that you hear their voices. You want to hear the introverts, because the introverts, and this is where my psychology background comes into play, is that knowing personality styles is important. An introvert is going to need much more time to be able to process the information and give a meaningful response. So they're not going to necessarily be rapid fire, and some introverts are great at that, but largely introverts need time to reflect, absorb, and to come with a thoughtful analytical response. So for those folks, and for the whole team, because not everyone would be able to have time to speak, we had Post-its, and just in the middle of the table, people would grab a Post-it and write their solution down. And then by the end of it, that person would walk away with this Post-it of solutions from all different disciplines. And their name wasn't on there. It wasn't about getting credit. And sometimes people could say things that were, you know, more unorthodox or unconventional that way, and they feel safe to be able to share their ideas. So it's a true brainstorming session, rather than being felt like you're going to judge, or they're going to tear down your idea because you're a woman or underrepresented and so forth. So that kind of climate and milieu that you set up as a leader is important, to be thoughtful of the kind of personalities you have around the table, and not just hire people that look like you and act like you and sound like you, to be intentional about that. Because we generally, as psychologically, we want to be around people that look like us. It's not that you're racist, it's just we're comfortable with that. Or with people who we are comfortable growing. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I'm used to all different colors, all different backgrounds, all different languages, all different races. And so for me, that's my comfort zone. That's my kind of, when I don't have that, I get uncomfortable, you know?
Right.
And so I look for talent everywhere. Whenever I'm at events of fundraisers and, you know, foundation events, I'm looking the best in class. And sometimes you just meet them in very serendipitous way. Like I met my data analyst, who was a guest at the United Way Foundation that we were supporting here in Fort Lauderdale. So she's amazing, right? And so African-American woman, it wasn't like, oh, let me go look for African-American woman that's a data scientist and like I'm like had an agenda to fit some box. But when you're open to it, your lens is open, your heart is open, your mind is open to talent, no matter what color, no matter what background, no matter what gender. Then when you see somebody who's really talented that you want on your team, then you have the ability to be able to reach out to them and bring them on and recruit them for your team.
Love that example.
So those are just...
Given what you've achieved in your professional career, you've had a broad experience in different types of organizations. What are some of the examples you can share for when an organization is performing well on gender equality?
You know, it's interesting. Benioff at Salesforce, I would say, has done this a really beautiful job of looking at parity in income among women in his staff. And he was very honest, and he had incredible team members that were basically volunteering to do this kind of data analysis, to do it. And it's not cost effective to do this as a business, right? Because that means you have to pay people more. But ultimately, it's a value proposition of people who know when they're coming to a place where they value all genders, not just women, as a 70% discount or a 30% discount, paying 70 cents a dollar on every dollar. It makes you feel like you're valued, and you're going to work harder. You're going to be more loyal. And you know, in millennials, right? If you want to recruit millennials who are much more quick to move around in their job and careers, because they want speed and moving up the ladder, you've spent a lot of time investing in millennials, and so you want to keep them and be loyal to them. So these are the kinds of things that actually attract talent. Not only attract, but helps you retain talent. So diversity actually helps you with your bottom line to be able to have diverse interests, diverse lenses, diverse disciplines, and diverse ability to be able to look at a problem from different angles. And so that really seamlessly from your last question to this question is really about being open to that analysis and that criticism, and to say, you're right. I mean, this is something that we need to look at. Why are women or any, underrepresented group being paid less? How are we valuing a male more because he's the head of household? Some men are deciding to stay home and take care of the family. That those archetypes that we had in the past are no longer. Women are working and want the same rights as men. And equality around the table, no matter what your race is so important for economic empowerment, and to show that your values are in line with your bottom line. And ultimately, it's good for your bottom line when you have that for recruitment and retention.
And as a follow-up question to that, what helps get more women a seat at the leadership table?
I think having people who are, allies are really important. I've always looked for people that I knew were going to challenge me, as well as people who would believe in me. And so I always gravitated towards people who are the best in class because I wanted to learn from them. And so I think the more you elevate yourself to people who are executing at the highest level, they tend to be much more open-minded about bringing in and supporting people around them. And mentorship is really important. I had some really incredible mentors that I wouldn't be where I am had they not seen something in me that I didn't even see. The dean of my university, when I was a graduate student, as a graduate student assistant, saw something in me and gave me the opportunity to write grants for homeless people here in Fort Lauderdale, the HUD grant, and I flew to Washington, D.C. to advocate for homeless. He saw that I was very passionate about mental health issues among the homeless. And so being able to detect that as a leader in people and seeing the diamonds in the rough, as it were, and knowing that with a little bit of support and mentorship, that they can really become great leaders and take that information, absorb it, and then take it to the next level. So I don't know if I addressed all of the question, but I think that really is part of cultivating mentorship. Is an important part of our family values and how we started our incubators here in Miami from Silicon Valley, is to really, and our family foundation, the Haynes Foundation, our values, the pillars are to increase access to healthcare, increase access to education, and economic resources through tech for good. And so if we use technology, we can use it in a way that actually changes and moves the needle in a positive direction.
Silicon Valley has built a method and philosophy of developing startups that seem to work really well. What are some of the barriers that entrepreneurs and startups face outside of Silicon Valley, and what methodologies can you share with us on how to effectively run a startup? I know you mentioned that you co-founded a startup with Usain Bolt, so maybe share a little bit of that with us.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I think the thesis that we have in moving, from Silicon Valley to Miami is to really show that Silicon Valley is a concept. It's not a place anymore, right? With remote learning, with that remote access, with technology, you can access almost anyone, right?
Right.
And so you don't have to be in California with the high taxes and all of that, although it's a beautiful place. And but there is ways of getting access, and this is an important part of our family foundation work with Haynes Foundation, is that we were able to bridge the gap with Howard University Hospital, the HBCU, with Silicon Valley elite venture capital, because all of those kinds of relationships are so important to be able to be an ally and build those alliances and make those introductions. And so the endowment that they've been able to invest in at Harvard can now be shared with Howard, and that's how you change societies, is through education, and giving access to education changes generations tremendously. And healthcare is also an important part of that. And you can't access healthcare and you can't access education and economic opportunity without transportation. So the way that, we got into working and investing in Uber, it's really about our own personal family values. My parents were immigrants when we came to the United States. My dad had a master's degree from Catholic University, and he wasn't able to get a job during the 1979 revolution that we fled from. And he had to drive a cab. And many times he would come home with the cash and he would give us the money to hold. Each kid would get the bag and, count the money. So it gave us a sense of responsibility and value for money. He'd work so hard and make $100 all day. One night he came home and he didn't have any money. And we were like, and he had some bruises, we noticed, and his clothes were disheveled. And we were like, what? And he came in late, and we always waited for him to have dinner, even if it was 8:39 at night. And we wondered what happened. And, he basically didn't tell us in so many words, but he was mugged, as a taxi driver in Washington, D.C. And so, our investment in Uber and using technology for good is that there's no cash being transacted, and who's getting in your car and who's leaving. You can't say, oh, it was a yellow cab that did this to me, or whoever I dropped off at this corner was the person who mugged me. So you have a lot more transparency and using data for good. So a lot of our thesis are investments with moving from Uber as a transportation modality to Hyperloop, Virgin Hyperloop One, as a transportation is such an important aspect of ability to be able to get to work on time, to be able to access healthcare, to be able to access education. If you don't have transportation, you can't access any of that. Be on time for work, the job that you worked so hard to get in the first place. So having economically, environmentally clean transportation like electric scooters was one of the investments that we made. And bringing Usain Bolt in was the genius of my brother, Shervin Peshawar, to call it Bolt mobility, right? To be able to get somewhere quickly in traffic, right. Even if you're, we invest in Uber, there's all these cars still sitting in traffic. We were trying to reduce the amount of cars and taxis rotating around, hoping to get a client. That way they can just, park somewhere and wait for the Uber, the button, the app to show where the clients are, so that not wasting gas and wasting and polluting the air. So anyhow, so this is the next level of solving a problem for the last mile was the electric scooter company. So having visionaries is really important. Like Shervin Peshawar was, is an incredible visionary for Hyperloop One, Virgin Hyperloop, and one of the first investors in Uber, Airbnb, and all of the investments that we made in Silicon Valley. Those are things that help change society and the way that things are regulated. So if you think of a problem that's regulated by the government, and there's might be a mafia for the taxi companies that you have to pay $1 million for a medallion, not everyone benefits and shares from that profit. But now we have people who are able to work and at flexible times with Uber and so forth. So, or Airbnbs, they can rent out their homes to make money. Has really been using technology for economic empowerment. So that's been sort of our thesis. And for the startup world, to answer that question, it's really about bootlegging as much as you can, getting people that are visionaries, but also people who are operationally minded to actually execute on the vision, and to be able to have the credibility to invest in the vision and the idea that there is a need and there's a better way of doing things. And instead of, building cheap scooters, we designed it from the bottom up so that women also can get ride it. We put it forward facing foot panels. So you have greater visibility, so it's safer. So we saw the problems with the other companies that came out very quickly with some less expensive scooters and solved for that. We put cup holders because we realized people were riding and trying to hold their coffee, and that's
Or
not
drinking.
safe, right? So we put 2 cup holders, and then we put storage unit. And we did all that within 6 months, from back of envelope design into actual being on the street with the regulation, with the permitting, with the team, and hiring and getting the infrastructure in the warehouses and all of that, and the app overlay. So we're used to working very quickly and around the clock to get things done. And so I think that's really important part of startup, is that people, think that it's a sexy world. But there's many startups that don't, succeed for multiple reasons. But I think one of the main things is to really think about the culture ahead of time, at the beginning. Who you hire is really important. And how quickly Uber grew, it was really difficult to, from the top, to know who are the people that are being hired. Will they maintain the same level of excellence and the same ethics and so forth? So I think that's part of the lessons learned that you asked before, is keeping the company culture as you're moving very quickly is very difficult. And so it's important to make sure in your hiring and training practices that people really embrace the idea of working around the clock is part of startup world. It's not sustainable for very long. So you have to have, things embedded within the day. That's why, Google, Facebook, all of those places that were startups at one point, did dry cleaning and all of that, because you didn't have time to go and do your dry cleaning, and they served food there. Absolutely. So you didn't have to leave, and you can be more efficient. You can continue to work around the clock. So there's ways of making sure people are eating and being healthy, and there's nap rooms and all of that to be able to sustain that level of energy that it takes to be first to market, and to be able to iterate and adapt and be nimble to continuously change to the market pressures and needs.
Last question, and I always ask this to all my guests. What has helped you get to where you are, and what of advice would you give to someone that wants to pursue a career that's similar to yours?
My career is so unconventional. So
very unconventional.
I would just say, to be open, to be curious, because, we all have our, 5-year plan and 10-year plan. You have these ideas of where you're going to be. And if you ask me, when I was 18, 19, when I was deciding on my career choices, where I'd be today, I'd never be able to tell you that I was here. I would never imagine that. So I would say, don't box yourself into a certain archetype of what you're supposed to look like, or who you're supposed to work with, or what kind of industry you're supposed to stay within. And, people kind of, look at you sometimes and like, wait, what, you're a PhD and you're doing what? And what, how did that happen? And so, it's people are curious about that. I think, just getting all of the right life lessons from waiting tables, which I did all through undergrad, to running my parents, like they had a nail salon. I managed that. I mean, there's opportunities and learning about entrepreneurship all around you. So being open to that, and not, holding your looking down at your nose and saying, oh, that I don't want to wait on tables. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to go and get the coffee. You have to be the intern. You have to do the grunt work. And don't let your ego and your pride get in the way of you doing something you think is beyond or, below you. I've never had that mindset. And I've always had this willingness to learn and roll up my sleeves and sit there with my team, getting the scooters out of the truck and, in Paris, and lining them up and talking to clients and people in Japan, all, and all the places that we've launched. Is important to actually be on the streets and have your pulse, finger on the pulse of what's happening with your team on the streets. And so I would say to really fully embrace all of the different departments wherever you're working, to learn all of the different mechanisms. The marketing is important, as is product development, as is customer service, everyone has an important role to play. And so the more you can learn and ask questions, I think that's really the key, is that curiosity, and to be a critical thinker, and to learn how to ask questions without being disrespectful, and without seeming arrogant. So those are all the emotional intelligence sort of things that I would say are important, because when you're dealing with STEAM, you're dealing with some really intelligent people. That's a foundational kind of known, but having the pushing yourself outside of your limit to be able to learn how to negotiate for your needs, to be able to set boundaries for your own health is important. And the 5 pillars of the Dr. Haynes Collective, which I'm launching, is to really look at how do we find greater balance around career and your finances and leadership. And your own personal growth is important. I've always been a continuous learner, right? When I got my PhD, I wasn't like, oh, I'm done.
Right.
I realized very quickly that there's so much more that I don't know. And it's those people that think they know everything that's the danger point, the overconfidence of thinking that you have all the answers and not asking questions before you move can be, the hyper confidence can be very dangerous. And so I would say, being humble to a certain point is important, but not to the detriment of people knowing who you are and your accomplishments. To be able to self-promote is important. It's not a bad word to be able to speak up about yourself. The humble brag, as it were, is important, to learn how to do that gracefully and elegantly, and to be able to, to be able to say, I need, a mental health day, right? I need to have a day off to be able to do the things that are important, go to the doctor, go to the dentist. Those are things without, waiting until you're, completely at the bottom of your rung, of your energy level to do that. And then also I would say family is a really important value. The people that I see are successful have a village, as it were, a community. And sometimes when we focus on our business and on our goals financially, we sometimes ignore and neglect our family and our community and our network, our relationships. So that's important part of the 5 pillars that are important to keep in the front of your mind rather than the back of your mind, because then you can kind of find that balance along the way, and to be able to have optimal success. I think that's really important to keep in mind, those 5 pillars.
Great. Dr. Haynes, I want to acknowledge your time and willingness to share your story with us. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.